one of the subjects that we could get into right away that the Florida people are probably most concerned with is some of the natural earth changes, and specifically to deal with the drought that we're going through right now. What can you...
Yeah, basically, and typical of me, start very basically in that the current drought right now, the last year, the last 4 or 5 years, is mostly cyclical as opposed to a sudden strange phenomenon. The Midwest, the last couple of years, especially certain sections of the Midwest and so on, is experiencing extreme drought conditions and so on. This is not the big earth change. A majority of the drought conditions is the 10-year cyclical dry weather, which oftentimes lasts for 2 or 3 years. So I would encourage people to anticipate, especially the farmers and so on, to anticipate much better weather in the next year or two. And now that I've said that the extreme degrees of the cyclical drought condition is not cyclical. I guess what I'm saying, let me try to say it a different way. All the way around the world, what you will be experiencing for the first time in better than 100 years, or a couple hundred years, or for the first time altogether, are record-breaking situations. In other words, in any given area, most people within the next year and 2 years will experience the record-breaking low temperature, record-breaking high temperature in those seasons, but also totally out of season, have a record-breaking low and high temperature, either extreme amounts of rainfall, which has already been taking place the last couple of years in places where they'll have 6 inches, a foot of rain, as opposed to a severe storm of 1.5 inches to 2 inches. And that is not cyclical, that is gradual earth changes by our standards, but extreme rapid earth changes by geological and astronomical measurements. That which takes place in 100 years is very quick by those standards. And yet we experience them that, the last 4 or 5 years I've noticed a lot more rain or a lot less rain. So it's kind of a trade-off, but I really want to emphasize, because of the things that we've been reading about in tabloids and talking about in groups like ourselves, the groups that we put ourselves in, that this is not the big emergency condition that you have to run from. Increased severity in hurricanes. The last season and the season that we're in right now actually has not been quite as intensive as I predicted. I mean, I really predicted some pretty devastating extremes. We have had a few more in numbers of those things that I talked about, which I know as far as I know, I'm very accurate on. I'm talking the last 5-year period of time, especially the last 2 years. Increased volcanic activity. I've been right on the money as far as, in other words, whatever I give a suggestion, I say, yes, there'll be an increase in number, and it'll be places like, and then list the places. And as a matter of fact, as we're filming right now, Mount Etna, what is today's date, do you know?
It's the 13th.
Okay. Well, so because of the time differentiation, and I mentioned this a couple of hours ago, it will have been then, which means either the 12th, last evening the 12th, and the 13th today of September, Mount Etna will be just quaking and spouting very beautiful, pictorially beautiful amounts of lava, but again, not devastating. In other words, I'm suggesting that I'm looking at the clock, if it's close to noon now, that around this time plus 6 or 7 hours difference, that this is actually subsiding right now, and that if it increases, it will not be utterly devastating, meaning wiping out a city or something like that. In the last couple of hours, it will have been very brilliant fire-type fountains and flowing down the mountain, Mount Etna itself, but not making a river. So that's something
Okay.
that we'll have to wait till tomorrow to see it in the newspaper,
Right.
or possibly on the news later on today. But then by the time that this is viewed in the weekend, that will have been history. I'm getting good at saying it will have had happened. You know?
I remember a couple of years ago about this time of year, you told us about the fact that we would see lightning in the snow, which
Yeah.
I'd never seen before, and we did.
I don't lie.
That was a phenomenon that was really interesting. Do you see anything, say in the next year, weather pattern-wise, or even with the hurricanes down around Florida?
First of all, to mix in with the lightning and the snow, because that is rare, and we experienced quite a bit of that in the Rochester area this last season, the season before, even though we had almost no snow, which was the all-time record least amount of snow that we've ever had. That's going to continue. Now, that is a combination of actual airborne particle, there's airborne chemical particles in the atmosphere, which give a conduit, so to speak, for the lightning to even travel through, So that which was never visually seen did take place, but it wasn't able to be focused in a single spot, in other words, to form a lightning bolt and therefore give off that flash of light. That's going to increase, by my standards, because of the increased pollution. I'm not blaming it on just that, but also the amount of disturbance in the upper atmosphere, meaning just outside our atmosphere, and I can't recall the different names for the different ionospheres and stuff like that, but in the near vicinity of the Earth itself, we're getting more meteorites and that type of activity, even if they just be small little ice balls as opposed to the iron-type meteorites. We'll have all of that, and that affects the electronics, so to speak, of the ionization of the atmosphere, I think I'm talking about. And that, therefore, we're going to have, and something that I've been waiting for in the last 5 years is what I'll call, super bolts of lightning. Meaning we have, lightning is big and strong and so on, and it's not nice to get struck by lightning.
We might want to go into that.
Yeah. It's not usually fun. But as opposed to that, which we've been measuring the last 4 or 5 years or in our lifetime, we should, this next season, meaning like next spring, the next couple of years, see extreme conditions. In other words, larger size bolts of lightning, more amperage, more voltage, and doing damage to buildings and things like that. Now, it's not just an increase in number, but an increase in intensity, with that. Again, it's not that you shouldn't go and play golf, but as a matter of fact, if you do play golf, that would be something to consider, as opposed to saying, well, let's see if we can get this last 2 holes in. And in the next couple of years, especially summer-type thunderstorms, you would really do well to actually be overcautious and get right off the open fields and out from under the tree and get inside a building that is grounded a little better. That's a serious consideration.
In terms of the radiation that's intensified coming into the planet, especially with folks living down in the Florida area, would you have any suggestions as far as the protection from the sun or the increased skin cancer?
Generally, it doesn't matter where you live. I would want to say to everybody, be extra cautious of that. Of course, we're learning enough now that to sit out in the sun and sunbathe and get that wonderful tan is not the greatest thing to do anyway. It never has been. But now, forgetting about that, about the, notice that by the time you're 45, you'll have as many wrinkles as I do. Worse than that, in just the last year or two, because I think I talked about this for the first time within, the last 5 years, let's say, and that the depletion of the ozone. Now, that's both fact and fiction. In other words, here we have with the scientists arguing with each other that that is cyclical too. That so-called hole in the above the Antarctic is cyclical. In other words, that's normal, and it goes in a cycle of a single year. So as they were measuring it for the first time in history, they were saying, wow, look, it's actually a depletion of the ozone layer, and that the ultraviolet rays are being extremely intense and not only shining and therefore melting the Antarctic at an accelerated rate, but reaching up to the southern tip of South America and any land masses nearby. And that is a serious precaution. I'm so stuck for words today. Yeah, it would actually be a precaution. For instance, if you're in that area, and especially in the summertime, the spring and the summertime, you really shouldn't go out. Because you shouldn't be exposed to the direct rays of the sun. As opposed to 5 years ago, it would have been really perfectly okay and normal by our standards. As far as where we live, in other words, in the United States, with the exception of Alaska and say, well, I guess the Aleutians are pretty well protected too. Again, the caution is still there, and you should minimize your exposure to ultraviolet gamma radiation of any kind, if it be from a laboratory or from the sun's rays. But the biggest problem is with skin cancers and things like that from the sun's rays. And that will be a good tenfold, by my standards, tenfold increase in intensity. And therefore, we humans will be 10 times more susceptible to that kind of exposure. And it should be minimized. As far as an extreme danger, are your friends going to start dropping like flies? No, not in the next year or two. But, you know, our habitual patterns, is what we do every day. In other words, if you're a sun worshiper, if you go boating, if you're a construction worker, you might want to start considering a job change, a change in patterns, that if you have an 18-foot runabout boat, okay, that's big enough to put a canvas, a canopy or a canvas. You might want to consider that, as well as consider, as opposed to fishing from sunup to sundown, fish a little bit in the morning and then late in the afternoon, as opposed to through the midday. Things like that, and we're going to have to be well, we're going to have to consider things like that, and give up a few things too. But generally, common sense will take care of everything that's taking place right now. It's the common sense precautions as to just running around naked in the sun, which is fun to do, but you might want to minimize that. I do anticipate the possibility within a very short period of time, and again, that means a couple of years as opposed to 10 years or 100 years, and especially my perception of Florida, and I'm not that familiar with Florida. In other words, I haven't been down there bodily. I haven't been down there walking around, but the fact that it is pretty well surrounded by the Gulf and the ocean and things like that, especially people that are along the shoreline, such as West Palm Beach, that, again, common sense should dictate that if you're going to have a house or a condominium or build a building on the shore, plan to have it flooded. I mean, just very bluntly, plan on it. I mean, don't deceive yourself and say, well, it hasn't happened in 50 years, or some attitude like this. In other words, actually anticipate it. That way, when there is a severe storm and our warning systems are getting much, much better, take heed, move out temporarily, and just say, I would rather have a house on the beach and have it flooded once a year, or have it devastated, have it wiped right out and rebuild, and then your attitude is such that you can plan accordingly. But if you start deceiving yourself, say, oh, this is just a bunch of mumbo-jumbo, and it's been going on for a long time, and people are being overly cautious and not enjoying their lifestyle, I would recommend that a little extra caution be taken. Again, my phrase is tsunami, which you don't usually consider in the Gulf of Mexico, but that type of event where you'll have a super wave, in other words, a tidal wave, but the way the wave functions in the middle of the ocean, nobody sees it, nobody experiences it. You can be on a ship and go up 60, 70 feet and be riding that wave and never even notice it, because it's more rounded as opposed to that curl type See, we think of a wave as crashing on the shore, curling. And as opposed to a wave function happening in the middle of the ocean, there's no white water to it. And it may or may not even push a boat. It will make the boat go straight up smoothly as the wave goes underneath. Well, regarding those very massive waves, again, the name comes to mind as tsunami, or an actual tidal wave, which will be created from geological activity in the Gulf of Mexico and in the Atlantic Ocean and off the Florida Keys, that area. Let's see, because we're at the end of summertime now, aren't we? Well, we're still right in the midst of this season. And I don't want to go out on a limb and either scare people or, say something that is incorrect. Be aware of things like that. The next couple of years, we should see something that will bring a lot of water up on the shore. I mean, that's very ambiguous. That's like saying almost nothing at all. But
going back to the melting of Antarctica, we had just read an article recently that if it doesn't just happen slowly, that if it collapsed all of a sudden, it would bring the oceans of the Earth up 14 feet or 16 feet.
Yeah, even if it'd be a few inches, that's very measurable.
Right.
And that would create, if that happened, that would create a totally different kind of erosion. In other words, massive erosion. It would change the water table all through Florida. Florida is very famous for basically sitting on water. There's the clear water, the spring water, and so on. I mean, to me, I often see Florida just as a big sponge. And it's okay, and you can enjoy the sponge, but be careful as to how much you dig out from under it and put pressure on top of it, because the sponge has a tendency to squish down or gush water or form sinkholes, things like that. And that the overdevelopment of Florida is a very serious geological problem right now. All development is not bad, but the amount of development is it's borderline right now. It's in the extreme condition, and it's being addressed too, not only politically but realistically. Let me put it this way: the developers of today, as opposed to 15 years ago, are interested in pleasing the people for the long-term effect. Because they, in their lifetime, don't want to say, well, I got my money and I don't care if it sinks or not, or crumbles or has water problems. The people are more compassionate now, the builders and so on. Still just as materialistic, but they will actually consider the long-term effect. And that's good, but don't let up on that. And whatever pressure people living in that area can put on that, is addressing the issue. Don't ignore that issue. If that continues, there's going to be loss of life because of just the vibration. Sometimes we don't consider that. In development, you're running heavy equipment, and just the fact that you have houses that are changing the wind patterns on the surface, in effect, equates to vibration. And things will either crumble and sink or form artesian wells because of additional pressures nearby. Now, there's water coming up, oils and things coming up out of the ground, as well as sinkholes and things of that nature. The pressure and pushing effect of shorelines, both inwardly and outwardly, has to be considered, along with just long-term vibrations, including extreme low frequencies, which we don't usually experience but exist. In other words, squirrel cage fans, exhaust fans of restaurants. People don't think that that's hazardous or detrimental, but if you have 4 or 5 restaurants on a corner, on a major intersection, they give off often extreme low frequency vibrations, which can literally crack the pavement. I mean, physically, literally, put that type of vibrational differentiation from that which was normal 5 years ago and create shattering effects. I don't want to just dwell on the negative, but sometimes you have to hear about this to then realistically say, well, I'm going to be aware of that. That's often enough for the caution. Because you actually asked about the Antarctic. I don't see a problem with the Antarctic either melting at an accelerated rate and creating a problem of water conditions, or the continent collapsing. I don't see that in the very near future, meaning 2 to 5 years. I don't really see that as a problem. There is a few things that can take place which are being cautioned and addressed, meaning scientific investigation and the pollution of the Antarctic. That's an extreme importance. The what-if scenario, if we make mistakes and either through our airborne particles have dust particles which are darker in color on a very minor scale. You won't even see it with your eyes necessarily, but the sun beating down on a piece of dust will scoot up to 200 degrees as opposed to the whitish or clear ice and snow. The whitish color will reflect that and remain at close to freezing temperature. That can be horrendous, and that can take place in a 2-year period of time. For instance, a major volcanic activity anywhere in the world can throw enough dust into the air and in 1 year's time coat the surface of the Antarctic, granted allowing for the snow, which will of course then cover up that dust. But the effect can be quite devastating. In other words, an extreme acceleration in a period of 2 years in time. And so in other words, with man's intervention, I say that there's no natural catastrophe or accelerated depletion of the Antarctic ice shelf. I don't see that as a problem at all. As far as it collapsing and creating the tidal wave action and so on, if that happens, then that is the scenario. In other words, the shoreline of Australia, South America, and so on, and eventually over a couple months period of time, reaching the inlets and bays and so on all the way around the world. That can have a worldwide effect, but I don't see that as a problem right now.
People are probably quite concerned about your health situation. Would you mind if we...
See, I'm smiling.
You're doing wonderfully.
Yes. Isn't drugs amazing? You know, they can make you smile even though you normally should be frowning. Yeah, I've got some rather serious problems in my back. I've got 3 herniated discs, fractured vertebrae, and so on. So no, there's some very physically real, undeniable problems. When it comes to, very bluntly, and I'll get right to the point where some of my friends said, Tom, we have seen you heal yourself before. What are you doing now? That trade-off between, see, it depends on, you know, somebody who listens to this film, I would wish that by now they have been exposed to different types of charismatic healing or the power of self-healing, love gestures, in other words, group healings, things like that. So first of all, accepting most of that which you've read or heard about. That is feasible, so why am I not doing it? Well, it just isn't correct for me right this minute, right now. I would dare say within the next month and a half, I may physically and spiritually and literally do something to assist myself. I'm not purposely not doing anything either. This is physical, this is real, and the difference between, for instance, accelerating a healing of a cut and a wound, cartilage damage, nerve pressures, like the sciatic nerve of the small of your back can affect paralysis in your legs and so on, which I'm experiencing from a physical point. Now, it's undeniably the disc, the protrusion of the disc is pushing on the nerve. Okay, so you have to physically move that. Because you can't wish it away. You can't have a sudden attitudinal change of the power of positive thinking and have the pain and paralysis go away from that. Many, many, many of those cases, I think more than half, can be totally cured and healed rather instantly by attitudinal change, which can be brought on by hugging somebody, by having somebody read a book, see a sunset, have a spontaneous spiritual awakening. All those things that create and cause sometimes an instantaneous healing or a very short period of time, which we may see as accelerated healing. Okay, that's all real and that works. Getting back to me, that's not the case in my physical situation. I'm going to require surgery as it stands right now. And that will be the quickest and most intelligent way to deal with this problem. I have a buildup of calcium which has to be chiseled away. Can that be dissolved other ways? Yes, it can, but it's not the most feasible way for me in my circumstance. As far as the amount of pain that I'm in currently and why I was not able to travel at this time, it had nothing to do with the traveling. It only had to do with me physically. And that this injury was actually experienced 7 years ago. And in 7 years, I have been spiritually and emotionally denying the existence of the amount of damage. And I have done well. And I'm now not paying the price, because I don't want anybody to get the idea that, I'm paying the price for feeling good for 7 years. But that's actually a true statement. In other words, you can't just go on denying, let me put it this way, if bone structure is moved or damaged or broken, all right, and it doesn't heal properly, heals at a 90-degree angle when the bone is supposed to be straight, well, in all probability, all the Om Shantis in the world aren't going to do anything with that. You're going to have to re-break it, set it properly, and allow it to heal. Now, if it takes 6 to 12 weeks, well, yes, you can do your little Om Shanti and have a good attitude and have it heal properly in 4 or 5 weeks. See, that's that borderline difference. For a majority of the situations where you can accelerate healing, but there are limits. In other words, see, some people are actually calling for a miracle. Now, it's for me to either create for myself or for me to, with God's intervention, have a miracle. It's not necessary. I mean, what do you ask for? That's too selfish. That's too extraordinary to expect a miracle. I know there's a cute little bumper sticker, and it says expect a miracle, and that's beautiful. But to realistically, for this purpose, because I'm in physical pain, to demand a miracle, you see, that's too selfish, and it's not correct. Regarding spiritual matters in general, you should request and expect, and God forbid if you have to demand something, but I don't think that's even possible, but to expect and participate in the minimum amount of energy to solve the problem or get the job done or reach the goal that you're after. See, this is a truth of almost everything spiritually. I'm philosophizing right now as opposed to just zeroing in on the problem with my back. And that's true of my back also. In other words, you can apply this to anything spiritually. You should request and should use the minimum requirement to reach the goal. My goal right now is to certainly feel better so that I can physically do more things. Excuse me, there is a possibility, not a probability right now, that I'd be paralyzed. And there's a realistic possibility of that. And I'll cross that bridge when it comes to it. Regarding that, right this minute, I don't know the outcome. I mean, very often I have talked about things that will happen to me, and they happened, and so on. Those, just know ahead of time. But regarding this situation, the total package, I can't know because it involves other people's free will. It involves the karma, so to speak, I'll use that phrase, the karma of the free will of my surgeon, of the system, meaning the medical system that I'm involved in right now, my free will, even Elaine, my wife Elaine's free will. In other words, there's too much involved for me to just be in total control. And, even if I was in total control, I would still have a need, if you will. I know that's, some people get furious when they say, I need this pain right now. And I just hope that somebody can either understand, or if they don't understand, just disregard it when it comes to me. I don't like talking about me anyway.
Okay. You were talking about accelerated healing, and a really good example of that was when your son Tim was in a car accident recently, and you talked about love bombing and positive thinking. Would you like to go into that?
Yeah, I want to compliment Father Dennis Bonsignor visited me a night or two ago, and I did tell him that if I had surgery, I would let him know when, so that he could, and what was his phrase, precision bombing. Yeah. Well, he knows that I like airplanes and things of that nature, so what he normally probably would have said love bombing or or the power of fervent prayer. He decided that for me it would be called precision bombing. And he has, of course, a networking of people who understand the power of prayer and love gestures of that nature. So when that time comes out, I'll have all I can handle, because I'll be precision bombed. The phrase I use, love bombing, is very important when it comes to healing the people around you. In other words, you in whatever condition and position you're in, with whatever knowledge you have, you might not consider yourself a healer, but you can be. And this is a good example. I like sharing it with people because this was handled not miraculously at all. This was my son, so I did do some abnormal things and so on, and for the purposes of, this was my son too, so I spent a little extra time and a lot of extra energy. But I don't want to focus on that so much. I want to focus on, come on, let's get realistic. Now, here you are, your neighbors think that you're nuts for going to metaphysical anything, and this and that and that and that. Well, when they have a headache, can you cure them of the headache? And not say, there's metaphysics, and I cured your headache. Never mind all the ego involved and everything. What do you do realistically this day and tomorrow? Well, Tim was injured severely in a car accident. The car slid into a tree at about 50 miles an hour. And Tim was in the passenger side, and the glass window of the passenger side, he was looking out, watching the tree come straight into his face. So not only was the tree, gave him a severe concussion, but of course the glass lacerated his face. It only required, I think, 17 stitches, not sure the number, but it was less than 20 stitches. But the cuts were severe and deep. In particular, one severe laceration that if you took a razor blade knife and traced around my finger like that, that flap was completely out. It was all the way into his cheek. That was probably the most severe, because being on the cheek and so on, could it go back in place and be healed? Well, with lacerations all over his face, a broken arm, injured ribs, and so on. Here's Tim, and when that took place, I was fortunate enough to be at the hospital that he would go to. I was working in the area.
Sounds like a similar story. I'll have to get into the other one.
Yeah.
Well, it's family.
Right.
Well, I planned the work day so that around that time frame I would be near the hospital. And in fact, they had trouble getting in touch with me because I was waiting at the hospital. Elaine gets furious when she hears this. And again, what should you do and what can you do? How dare you conceivably, precognitively know about the injury of your own son and allow it to happen? You have to do that. I mean, the truth of the matter is, and the true love of the whole system, meaning life in general, is you can't interfere with life's learning experiences, karma, things like that. You should not interfere with that. You should interfere with that very cautiously, very carefully, and also minimally. So I did my part to make sure I was in the right position, meaning at the hospital. And when Tim arrived, I helped with the stretcher, pull him out of the ambulance, and he was conscious at the time. And most important thing is the eye contact. In other words, for him to be able to see Dad there, or Dad or Mom. I don't mean to play favorites or anything, but to have somebody familiar there to make him that much more comfortable. And I just, like any parent would do, I put my hand on his chest very gently and got a little closer and winked at him and just said, casually, like, how you doing? Not actually asking the question, but really saying hello. And he looked up and recognized me, and he said, hi, Dad, I guess I look pretty bad, huh? And I says, well, don't worry about how you look right now. He says, just, relax, and everything's okay, and, you're going to be all right. You're going to be hurting for a while, and you're going to be all right. It was with that attitude. Then, of course, proceeding on with the things that you have to do in an emergency hospital, and I was allowed in to stay right with him. And, the people there recognized that the sight of all the blood and everything wasn't going to bother me, so they knew that it would be just as well for me to stay by his bedside. Elaine arrived and so on, and she was better than she's ever been when it comes to one of her baby boys being hurt, as well as a lot of blood and things like that. In other words, Elaine cut her finger one time rather deeply, and she fainted from it. She went right down on the floor. This time she didn't faint. She got a little squeamish one time when she was out of the room, just thinking about it, but she was excellent. I mean, she was better than average. So, consoling the three of us, we were at the emergency and so on. Well, then I proceeded to explain to Elaine, which is a good example because I want to share this with people, that everybody can do this and everybody should be doing this. A couple of suggestions are, here you have a lot of injuries. You have lacerations, you have broken bones, you have somebody who is feeling ill, somebody that is not at ease, they're in a state of dis-ease. So how do you make them more at ease to get rid of the disease or the injuries? Again, I like the word attitude because generally, never mind what you do with your hands, it's what do you do with your attitude. And if you have a loving, selfless attitude, it doesn't much matter what you do with your hands. Some people go like this, some people have to hug and touch. That is not so important to the individual as the proper attitude. Well, with a loving attitude, with a selfless attitude, first, look at the person. And if you're not the type of person who looks straight into people's eyes, in other words, just direct eye contact, or when you're talking with somebody, if you do what I do on purpose sometimes of purposely looking away, or if I'm about to say something that's emotional, I'll look away and callous myself. When it comes to somebody that's in a devastated state or that you wish to give energy to, well, one of the ways in which you transform that energy so that they can recognize it, even if it be subconscious, is to love them with your eyes. Because as they look up and see the intensity on your face, or see the amount of love, they can often see it in your eyes, and they can't see it in your hands. You might pat them gently, and that feels good, but they'll be able to see the intensity of that in your eyes. Think of those things as you start to do it. As you're walking down a hospital hallway, think of the things that I'm saying now and prepare yourself for it. Now, never mind that they owe you $5 or that they did a bad thing to you or you don't really like this person's looks or the way they smell or the things that we measure. I mean, just get those thoughts in your mind and then make sure that you don't concentrate on them. Just drop them. You're about to love somebody unconditionally. And
without pity, you had said you didn't really allow anyone to come in and go, oh, poor Tim.
Right. Culturally, we do this. Yeah. Culturally. I mean, come on, if you're lying there in the bed, what do you want to hear somebody come in the room? You might actually wish for some sympathy, but what's really best? I mean, walk right in, and here's the things you want to bring with you. Of course, love, needless to say, but bring humor. I mean, bring humor. That person, in the first 12 hours, assuming they're conscious, and even if they're not conscious, talk to them. Talk to them as though they are conscious. Talk to them as though they can hear you, because not only should they be able to hear you, they can probably hear you more intensively than when they're awake and hearing you with just their ears. Because comatose people, unconscious people, certainly do hear, and oftentimes they hear extraordinarily well. So be aware of that too. Go in there with a loving attitude, and even if you have to stoop to the silly, dry humor joke, use it. Even if it's not necessarily a funny joke, but it's a joke. Well, don't joke at them. Be cautious about joking about something that could conceivably offend them. It's an ethnic joke or things of that nature that might possibly offend them. Eliminate all those things that could offend the person. But smile. Tell them of your concern. Gee, I'm sorry that you're hurt. I'm sorry for this. If there's something I can do. And let's get over the social amenities. Is that how you say that? Amenities? I don't know. I don't speak English. Get over those things, but then love bomb them with humor. Touch the person. If the person is all bandaged up, put your hand on top of the bandage somewhere or near them. I'm not saying look for the wound and put your hand there. I'm saying if their one arm is okay and it's near the side of the bed, get close enough and put your hand in there for just a minute or so. Be like a third-generation Italian-American. You've got to tell them something, reach out and touch them as you're talking. Even if you have to role play and you're not used to doing this and you have to do it. Even if you have to say, you know, would you mind if I just touch your hand? In other words, if it's your brother or sister and you've never been at all demonstrative with them, like touching, then say, would you mind if I just touch your finger or touch your hand or your forehead or something that's suitable, and do it for the first time, and hopefully that'll become automatic. Touch the person with a positive attitude, love that person, bring humor into their life. If you have to hand them a joke book that they'll be reading the next day or so, give them a joke book. Tim got home from the hospital, and I cautioned Elaine, or I told Elaine, very specifically with great detail, which I won't share because some of that is personal and private regarding Elaine's character and Tim's character, and dealing with the two of them. But I said, do not talk about this, and this. In other words, the things that you've been bothered with lately, the things that are Tim's personal characteristics that are lacking, in other words, his inadequacies. Don't talk about money. Don't talk about the price of the hospital bill. Don't talk about... eliminate those things. They're not necessary and they're not entertaining. You want to entertain that person in the most positive nature. Love bomb them, surround them with humor. I told Elaine, I said, I don't care the cost. You go and you bring every videotape of every comedy movie. I don't care if it's R-rated or Walt Disney or whatever. And you have them on... If he asks for a movie... You go and get the movie that he wishes for, but then you also get a second movie that is comedy. I don't care if it's Three Stooges. Some people are offended by slapstick comedy. Doesn't matter if it's comedy, it's okay. As opposed to adventure movies, as opposed to war-type movies, things of that nature. Joke books, tell jokes, smile. If you're in a bad condition, come in, smile, and say, I just want to stop in, give you a smile, and love you, and then leave. In other words, if you're hurting, if you're emotionally stressed, don't stick around, because those vibrations are going to be shared, whether you want to or not. And come back when you're feeling better. I told Elaine, I want you to touch Timmy more than you normally do. Imagine telling a third-generation Italian-American to touch more than they normally do. So she's good at that. But I said, do these things more. You were involved in that in a way, because, we were all love-bombing Tim. What am I leaving out? I think what I'm trying to really emphasize is the humor aspect of it.
Right.
Don't make a joke of the injuries, but make a joke in spite of the injuries. And some people are very careful, well, this is humor and this isn't. Well, never mind what you think is humorous. It's generally considered humorous and funny and upbeat. I mean, if you could see... In fact, Raymond Moody wrote a book that he doesn't claim anymore. And it was really a good book. I think the timing was off on it, why it didn't really sell very well. So it's out of print now, but of course it was his third book that he wrote, and the title was Laugh After Laugh. And then the subtitle was The Power of Humor in Healing. And he, Raymond Moody, being the fundamentalist that he is and the scientist and the medical technician that he scientifically dealt with the Norman Cousin scenario, where he laughed himself out of cancer. And then he dealt with it, a study that he actually did. In other words, measuring the amount and the different rates of healing of children's hospitals that allow clowns to come in and the ones that weren't able to or didn't. And I mean, it's lopsided. I mean, it's just, there's no question at all that to have humor, to have a patient surrounded by humor is better than drugs. Not as an absolute substitute for drugs, although I would say 80-90% a substitute for many, many drugs. I would not say if you need penicillin, no, you take the penicillin and then laugh about it, right? And it'll accelerate the healing. With Tim, he went to the a few weeks later. I don't recall the time. I think it was supposed to be just 5 weeks. At any rate, the not the dermatologist. What's the skin specialist? Surgeon.
Yes. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, well, anyway, the surgeon
Do
there.
you have that picture, Wendy?
Yeah, somewhere. Just see. I don't know if you'll be able to see this on the screen. If you focus on this, then I'll
Tip it forward at the top a little to take the glare off.
Yeah, got it.
like that.
Yeah.
Right, this was a couple of days. As a matter of fact, this might have been on 4 or 5 days into the. Should put this in here. This is just Tim's face. Now his concussion, his head moved in the first 48 hours 5 times very dramatically. I mean like 2 inches, not just from the lump on his head on one side, but I mean kind of like pear-shaped, and then the opposite of pear-shaped. And of course that was the emergency, that he would have some kind of brain trauma from that. Turns out that he did not. He survived that quite well. And then as far as the healing of his face and so on, well, we were cautioned that he certainly would need surgery, plastic surgery, and that the caution was don't worry about it for 6 months. In other words, if it just be dermabrasion to get rid of the bumps and so on that would be left over from the extreme lacerations, and the fact that the skin was exposed to was deadened, exposed to the air and so on before it was able to be sutured. Don't worry about that for many months. It's also important, I think, the 5th day. I'm sure no longer than the 7th or 8th day. I've lost track of the exact number of days. To come into the office and get the sutures removed so that you won't have additional scarring from the stretch marks of the suture. Well, we waited right on time, and we had an appointment. We went in there, and the surgeon came out and saw Tim in the hallway, and he shrieked. And then he got very angry, and he started yelling at, not really at me or at Tim, but he was yelling that there was a mistake made, that Tim was supposed to come in at that exact time to get those sutures removed. And then I had to tell him, well, this is the right time. And what he was thinking, and he told me, and he said, my God, he said, he's just all healed. And he said, we really expected to get these out long before this. And then he looked at the records, and he says, well, wait a minute, this is only, and if it was 5 days, let's assume it was 5 days. He said, oh, well, this is only 5 days. And I started laughing, and I said, well, Tim's 15 years old, he's young, and the doctor's glaring at me, and he did ask me a few questions afterwards. And I just answered him casually. I didn't, certainly didn't brag that, oh, well, in our household, this or that, or anything like that. I just said, well, if you have a good attitude and you're surrounded by humor like we did with Tim, you can pretty well count on accelerated healing. And he smiled and laughed. And I've seen him one other time since then. And we've gone off on a tangent and talked about various things that a family can do to accelerate the healing. Well, make this long story short, regarding Tim, within just a couple of weeks, there is one spot right on his cheek that you will not notice anymore. In other words, it's not even the equivalent of a small zit or a pimple. And Tim looks for it. In other words, he'll look in the mirror, and he knows it's there, and he wants to keep it. In other words, he doesn't, because Elaine, of course, being the loving mother, she says, well, it doesn't matter. You should have that removed if it required dermabrasion or whatever. And Tim says, no, I actually like it. He says, it's kind of cool, it's kind of macho and this and that. But it is not noticeable at all. And no, that was not a miracle. It was accelerated healing. It was, he's a 15-year-old healthy boy. All those things mixed in the mixing bowl. The healing time was probably 1/2 of what the doctors anticipated and expected, about half. And that was almost totally, more than 85% of that accelerated healing was by Elaine and the family. Tim did receive, I have to be honest and say, Tim did receive, I don't know two individuals talked to Tim and asked him of his receptivity toward hands-on healing type thing. And that was also done. But I want to emphasize that let's be fair and say, given an additional 5% additional accelerated healing, or 5% of the time maybe, but not any more than that. In other words, I'm not saying that there was a miraculous hands-on healing by either one of those two individuals that I'm referring to. I want to emphasize that 85% of all of that was just the love bombing, the humor, and so on. And even if a person is in a bad mood, to subliminally have a videotape of humor in the background, even though they're not listening to it, that works. Their favorite music, to have it low level in a tape recording in the background is better quality. I mean, I prefer good quality. And if you can have a better stereo system, and even have it in the room, and they be watching television, concentrating on that, to have their favorite type music, and more toward a soothing, healing type music as opposed to hard rock. With all due respect to rock and roll, if they're in the process of healing tissue, they don't need that strong, vibrational, sensationalistic, excited response that rock and roll music does to somebody who enjoys rock and roll music. It's an entirely different set of vibrations. It's excited, it's hard. Even the word hard rock, it's hard. And for fine little cells and tissues to be healed together, they don't need that brash harshness. I'm not saying absolute violin music unless they're receptive to that, but you know, that's for the individual to decide their favorite type of music.
You talked a little about this incident having a little precognition of it. Are there any other situations? I could name a few, but I'm not sure which ones you want to cover today.
Well, the one that you're thinking of, was Todd's broken leg, and that was very severe. Required surgery, broke both the tibia and fibula, and injured the growth plate. Now, I'm trying to remember how old he was at the time. It wouldn't have been, yes, it would have been 12 years old. Okay. You help me with my memory, because like the details that now don't matter to me could be very important.
That would have been 2 years after your accident.
Yeah. Boy, that was...
Now, you were on the job at the time, and you knew...
Just in that time frame, I want to just make one statement in that time frame, because that would be 1980. And those are what I call in hindsight the psychic years, because I was bombarded by psychic stuff, even bothered by. I think about half of the events and the situations. In other words, my psychic receptivity initially, and then the psychic events that took place from 1980 to 1984. Well, you know, I'd like to smile and say they were out of hand or I was out of hand. Nothing really tragic or bad happened, but the numbers, the amounts, the intensities were not something that I would wish on anybody. And I refer to that like backwards in time as the psychic years, even though I think my ability to assimilate and handle the same psychic receptivity, or similar enough psychic receptivity on my part, I'm able to deal with that now. And the psychic drivel, the psychic trash, the numbers of events, the selfish or sensational desire for me to know that that's a DC-9 flying overhead right now, right, that can be limited. It can be handled properly. And that's okay to know that. And things like that, but keep it in perspective. Right, so therefore I was very, very psychic at this time. However, regarding the Todd incident where he broke his leg so bad and injured the growth plate, that was precognitive during my near-death experience. So, and just a year or so ago, Elaine found the details of this out for the first time. That I had, graphically, in great detail, precognitively known and shared with Dr. Kenneth Ring, and he wanted to put that in the book, and I said no, because the book will come out before this happens. I was afraid of that. So I knew about it ahead of time, and I didn't know the day, because I didn't have the number day written down. In fact, I didn't have anything of that written down that was publicized or that I would have around the house. Well, anyway, that day rolled around, and I was running a front-end loader, a payloader type front-end loader, and just noisy and doing my job and so on. And I was probably, as the crow flies, maybe 2.5, 3 miles from Todd's school. Because some people ask me, where were you geographically in relationship to Todd? Some person thought that I might have been within hearing range of Todd. Well, I certainly wasn't within hearing range. But what I experienced very bluntly was instantly, it's funny to say this way, but as the event took place, in other words, the breaking of the leg where he was on a soccer field and met the goalie, and in a twisting motion, the leg was broken. So at the same time I was experiencing that, clairvoyantly, I'll use that phrase because it's correct, clairvoyantly, it was just as though there were 2 stereo speakers, one on each of my shoulders, and it was Todd just saying, "Oh, Dad, I wish you were here," which, I'm a proud father. That was nice, and that boosted my ego and so on and all that. And when Todd was in an emergency or dangerous situation, it would have been typical of him to wish me there, as opposed to Elaine. In other words, if it was something technical to be done, well, ask Dad to do it as opposed to Mom. If you need just a hug, well, then ask Mom to hug, and then talk about it later on with Dad. So at any rate, he did say that as he fell to the ground. Well, that was, like I say, just so it was yelled right into my ears. So I just slammed the bucket of the loader down, leaped off the top of the loader, and went to my foreman's pickup truck and grabbed him by the shoulder and pulled him out of his truck, and I stole his truck. And I said, Chet, take the load. I yelled this as I'm driving away, and he's like, what in the world's going on? And I said, there's a family emergency. Take the loader back to the highway. And I took off. And I did go to the highway department, jump in my personal car, and race to the hospital. Now, intuitively, I knew, and it was a different hospital, in fact, Rochester General Northside. I went there, and Todd wasn't there. Now, I did have a few moments of an oh my God situation. I've sensationalized this, and this is not correct. Well, I knew that Todd was hurt, but I thought, I've gone to the wrong hospital or something like that. And then I was dealing with, but I know this is true, but here I am, and the reality is that there's nobody here. So I went to the nurse and explained, did somebody come in unconscious? Is there a 12-year-old boy, Todd Sawyer? I was asked all the questions. She said, no, I'm sorry. And I said, well, are you in, and then I hesitated, and I said, is the emergency green light right now? Because the ambulances have a system where they will go to a different hospital if they're not so booked up. And so she smiled, and because I didn't say the right phrase, but she knew what I was talking about. And she says, yes, we're not really that busy. Do you believe that? So I said, well, I must have made a mistake. So I went to the telephone, and I looked up and called Todd's school. Well, as I called Todd's school, the conversation went like, oh, Mr. Sawyer, we're so glad you called. We've been trying to get in touch with you. We want to tell you that your son is hurt and that he's on his way to the hospital. They're taking him in the ambulance. And, it's not life-threatening, but he is hurt very severely. And we wanted to get in touch with you. And I said, well, that's why I'm calling. I said, do you know where they took him? And say, yes, they took him to Northside Hospital. I said, well, there must be some mistake because I'm here now and he isn't here. And she said, well, gee, I don't really know. Let me double check. And she asked somebody else in the background. She said, yes, they're taking him to Northside Hospital. I said, okay, well, he just isn't here yet. So I hung the phone up and turned, walked around and nervously anticipating. And then the ambulance showed up, and of course I met the ambulance at the hospital. And that was very important for Todd to have that eye contact. I think actually more important, how dare we judge one against the other, but It was more important for Todd to see me there. In fact, in that time frame, I was there as he reached the hospital because Todd had requested me. Now, that's emotionally and, shall I dare say, spiritually, he had requested me. There's a little difference between, oh, I wish my parents were here, and then wishing that one single individual was there. That's another story. So it was very important for me to make that eye contact and, to touch Todd and help him out and so on. So that was that story. Todd was okay, and turns out that the doctor said that he would need surgery, that he would have a limp probably for the rest of his life, which may or may not be corrected with therapy and even conceivably in the worst scenario, corrective shoes, but that obviously the growth plate was injured. Turns out that the surgery went very well, and as soon as he opened the ankle part, the ligament that was involved and so on, everything snapped back in place. And Todd healed very rapidly. A little accelerating healing, but that was 80% Todd, as opposed to things that I could have done to assist or help. And that was the end of that story, except the part that Elaine didn't know that I was aware of it ahead of time. And I mean, there's things that you should tell and things that you shouldn't tell. And I knew that Elaine would not understand at all. In fact, even become furious at me. So it did go for these many years, and just, I think about a year ago, Elaine found out that I think it was at the Geneseo conference of 2 years ago. It was a full year ago, 2 seasons ago. And she was a little shocked, but Elaine has really learned a lot, and she's almost shock-proof now. But she did react, and she had the typical reaction that would be the average person saying, now wait a minute, if you know about something in the future, why don't you do something about it? And that's a whole long story that you can't just tell quickly, because that's not correct. Sometimes there's an aspect of a precognition that you can become involved and do something, and other times it's just for no reason at all, I or you have to know about it.
But you can't change it.
Right. As I've been given, it's because I don't think that I am doing this on my own, I don't seek out precognitions, but they'll happen, and then there'll be an aspect that also tells me or shows me that, well, here's something else that will be history, and I have to know the history ahead of time. For a reason or no reason at all, shrug of the shoulders. That's difficult at times, when it comes to tragedies especially. See, the judgmental aspect doesn't exist in spirituality, most often. To say, oh, a plane crash is terrible, and to precognize a scientific breakthrough is glorious and nice. Isn't it nice to know that the linear accelerator or the, conductive supercollider will do this or that or that? That's nice to know ahead of time, as opposed to like the L-1011 plane crash in Texas was devastating to me and to anybody, naturally.
We plan to go into that today, but that might need a... There's a movie being aired tonight on TV.
Excuse me.
Yes, dear.
Welcome back.
Okay.
Did you stretch? Have a good time?
We did.
A little bit of drink? A little bit of food? Yeah, welcome back. Now go.
There's a movie being aired tonight about the plane crash of the L-1011 in Texas.
Yeah, I'm as sure as I can be that it will include that at least, because I don't know what the program is about. I'm hoping, just for my selfish self, I'm hoping that it'll be similar to a documentary on the airplane and the crash itself, but there's a possibility that it will be a movie, an adventure. I can't imagine romantic, but in other words, a person-type movie on the characters involved, meaning how it affected or changed the lives of some of the people, or how people acted and reacted before and after the event. So I don't really know the context of the movie, but as a matter of fact, that they depicted the same plane, which is my favorite airplane, commercial airliner, and in fact it was a Delta L-1011, which flight 1071 will be flying from Atlanta, Atlanta to West Palm Beach, Florida, I believe this Friday. And you know, it's funny because of my attitude toward death and the constant flow of humor, which is really not only therapeutic for me, but almost a necessity. And my general attitude and a lot of the jokes that are going around, as well as the serious side that, you know, I would really, if I had my druthers, if I had my preference, I would prefer to not be alive. I would prefer to be dead and be in that light, or, you know, focusing and functioning from that point instead of from this point. It was my personal preference. So the terribly dry humor aspect of, because I'm not able to make this trip to Florida, God forbid for everybody else, if anything happens to Flight 1071, I am going to be so angry that I was not on it. And it's like, you know, I'm playing with predestination, and then, gee, I hurt my back, I wasn't able to go on the flight, and then have something happen, which would be a tragedy to everybody else in the world except me, because I'm looking for a legal excuse to be dead. You know, I also am still waiting to have that confrontation, the finalization of the conversation with my surgeon, because he will ask questions regarding the surgery. And what he doesn't know is I have a few questions for him, a few statements, including the very honest and realistic, if anything happens. I mean, you know, a mistake, the ceiling falls in, something like that, and to use no additional, no excessive means at all to maintain life.
Right.
It was that straightforward business thing. But then he's also going to ask me a question about my attitude. I mean, I guess they all do that now.
Yeah.
I know that he will, because a couple of other patients have already mentioned to me. So I'm just waiting for, I don't know how I'm going to answer, I'll be honest. But I don't know his reaction when he said, you know, you certainly are looking forward to the surgery for the purposes of getting on with your life and being healed. And, you know, he's going to say, well, you know, or, what is your attitude toward death? I'm going to say, yes, when? Do you know? Yeah.
That movie, it's the name Fire and Ice, Fire and Rain.
Yeah,
No.
right, Fire and Rain.
And Rain.
Yes,
Okay.
Fire and Rain.
That,
And
that whole
it's a
situation.
2-hour movie also, so I think it's a separate movie.
Yeah.
But anyway, that brought the subject up
Yeah.
of the L-1011 and that event. I'm sure that it focuses on and around the Texas air crash.
Yeah. Tell us how that whole thing impacted your life as a precognitive.
Yeah, that was, I think that was one of the top 3 precognitions that I've experienced that, well, inadvertently were sensationalized, over-advertised, overused. I have to chastise myself and say that my participation in it, I became on my own through, you know, just demand and desire and compassion and all the different things, way overly attached to it, meaning that if you have a precognition, you may have to act and react a certain way. But if there's no additional information as to what you should or can do, then leave it alone. And actually, it would be much better to let it go and forget about it than to hang on to it and wait for that day or tell somebody kind of semi-secretly like we often do. Those the person that is your friend and your ear that you can share things with, that you know confidentiality will be maintained, things like that. Right? That's all okay, but then let it go. And what regarding this initial precognition and then the events that led up to the event, and even in hindsight, I've been very incorrect by overly attaching myself to it, sensationalizing the aspects of it, as well as just the initial impact that it had on me. Curious enough, I participated very often in what I call roundtable discussions, which, you know, you don't need a round table, you don't need more than one person, sometimes you only need a tape recorder to to just go off on a dialogue and discuss anything. All right, but at the University of Connecticut, I would also often be invited for 3-day weekends and talk all that time. And sometimes they'd have questions waiting for me. Other times, let me put it this way. One time a physicist, was concerned of my lack of education and that I didn't know the math because he had some very technical questions to ask of me regarding quantum physics. And he was asking Dr. Kenneth Ring, well, how am I going to explain this to Tom to be able to ask the question if he doesn't know the math? And Ken Ring just laughed and said, well, you just say anything you want to say, get Tom on a roll, and don't worry about it. It'll happen. Well, he said that jokingly and so on, but it also, especially in that time frame, again around 1984, was that very often, if you or anybody had a subject, you just say the first 2 or 3 words of the sentence, and then I would just start palavering or talking on the subject, and it often got very intensive or very technical. Again, that's not my fault, because if I was receptive psychically or spiritually to the bona fide information regarding a subject that isn't even known yet, like the first time I came up with the word chaos for the new science, or a medication. I gave somebody information about a medication which would be the only relief for them, but it was not to have been discovered for a couple of years yet, which was sad for me, and that was the only answer. And it did in fact turn out to be the only answer. I gave some more information as to what this young lady could do to alleviate some of the pain and suffering that she was going through, but as far as having a topographical cream or a medication, it required this that wasn't developed yet. And then as time went on, I questioned if they would call it the same thing I did, because it was a goofy word, kind of like a Greek word. And then eventually in the newspaper, somebody sent me a clipping that it was spelled correctly and that they'd used that. So I was curious. Well,
how far in advance?
Well, this was strange in the way that it was more than a year ahead. Strange for me, in other words, if you take the many dozens of precognitions that I've had, 30 days ahead would be typical. I don't mean to say normal. You have to be careful saying normal regarding this. Usual would be typical. Short periods of time, like the next day, and again, as opposed to precognitively, clairvoyantly is the same thing, only meaning like, gee, do you know what's going on right now in Italy? Because the current volcano is subsiding right now. That type of thing. But this was precognitively, and often I have a very difficult time with time, meaning I don't think in terms of August 17th, or number days, or the month, or the day of the week. In other words, I'll know what season it is, like the 4 seasons. And oftentimes you'll hear me say, let's see, that was several years ago and it was cold out, which means snow on the ground or cold out, therefore it wasn't the middle of the summer. Although, we have to watch our weather. Yeah, it did snow yesterday and today in Colorado. 8 or more inches. So, funny little thing. Well, at any rate, this was more than a year ahead, and it was in October of 1 year. Bear with me. Let's see. This would be either the October of '83. See, I guess that would have to be so. October of '83, possibly October of '84.
When did the actual crash occur?
Well, now let's see. My terrible memory says it would be. Well, it was certainly in July. August 2nd, July 2nd. See, there. I just can't associate with the number days.
What was the year?
I would say that it would have to be August 2nd. The event took place. I'm guessing that, so don't quote me on that. But within a week or so of that. And in fact, let me tell it a little backwards, because this will tie it in. For instance, I talked about it many, many times, not on purpose really. Somebody would ask me a question about either airplanes or precognitions or something that the scenario of the Texas air crash would be a perfect analogy. So I say, well, let me give you an analogy. For instance, if there was going to be a plane crash, and then what the people didn't know was I was giving the details of that which has not taken place yet, which was an actual precognition. In other words, I didn't say, well, there's a precognition going on right now. I didn't say that. But then eventually, one man who had been to several of my talks and had taken notes, he confronted me and he said, Tom, you know, I so appreciate getting a chance to talk with you like this. And he said, I want to tell you that I've been to several of your talks in a row, and whenever a question comes up like plane crashes or no, he listed a bunch of things, and he said, you give an analogy, and he said, I want to call you on it because you're not making this up. He says, first of all, I think you're talking about a real event that hasn't happened yet. Well, I got very emotional because, you know, I didn't intend that. So, you know, I said, well, yeah, I guess that's right. And he said, well, regarding that, he said, do you have any idea the details that you have said? And he said, and then, of course, he flipped a couple pages of his notebook, and he just said, well, the plane is, I'm not sure if he didn't know airplanes, so he says, an L-1011, but he says, then you've also said a Lockheed TriStar. So then I smiled at his ignorance, and I said, yeah, I said, it's the safest plane in the air. And I said, it's a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar. And so a few more comments and so on. He said, well, here's my problem. He says, if you can know the first names of the people on board, and you can know serial numbers of parts of the plane, if you can know that it's 103 degrees in air temperature outside the plane, and if you can know such detail, you mean to tell me you can't do any better job than to say that it will happen in the warm weather of, now I have to stop and think, I'll guess at 1985. I think it was 1985. I'm guessing that's August 2nd of 1985. So anyway, he said, you mean to tell me you can't do a better job at saying that it'll be in the warm weather of 1985, and when this conversation took place in July of 1985. And it was also, I'm quite sure, the second week or the third week in July of 1985. It was toward the end of July of 1985. So he said, I'm asking you straightforward, can you give me a better date? And then I was disgusted at myself that I couldn't write down the airport, the exact airport. I knew what it looked like, and I traveled around to different airports to see. In other words, if I had gone to that airport, I would have instantly known, oh my God, this is the airport, because everything would be there, maybe except for the plane. And so that would be for sure. Then also, to deal with the time, of course, that would be ridiculous. How am I going to learn that? So I said, all right, well, let me just try, because I always want to answer anything and everything. So I was quiet for probably a full minute or more, and I was really, thinking, I was just trying to think, well, come on. All right, get through the seasons. Okay, it's hot weather out. Now, what about time frame? And then what I did was I zeroed in on, well, if this is now, meaning if this is toward the end of July, when will it take place by? So I made the statement, and I'm trying to quote myself, made the statement that as best I could formulate it, and I said, well, all right, let me put it this way. That plane will crash sometime between the 1st of July, and it will have had taken place by my birthday, which is the 1st of September. But then, and now see, that was ambiguous. Again, I'm trying to think, and I'm deciding it will be like. When I say the word like, that's not a fact. But when I go like this with my hand, it's a gesture. When I go like this and I say, it will happen exactly halfway between that. Well, that's fact. You have to kind of know me to see the difference, something that I'm not sure of, and I'll often overemphasize that I'm not sure of it. But then if I straightforward look at you and say, it will be like this, see, I said the word, it will be this. And that's like emphasizing it in fact. So I said it will be halfway between that time. Never realizing that halfway between that time would be just a couple of days from when this man is asking me this question. Well, they were polite enough to have no reaction. In other words, they didn't say, they didn't call me and say, well, Tom, you're being ridiculous because halfway between that time is right now. Or you only have 4 more days before the halfway between that time is. In other words, I was sitting there not realizing that it was already into July, which is typical of me. So, anyway, that took place, and of course, needless to say, it happened on the day. Now, the day it happened, I got up and went to work, and it was the morning just before the crash. That was that date. I opened the door to my house, and when I opened the door, the newspaper flopped down flat. Now, understand, this is the morning the plane crash had not taken place yet. But when that newspaper flopped down, I mean, if it be a catalyst or not, but all of a sudden I looked down, and it was though I was looking at the next day's newspaper. In other words, it was as though, I mean, I wasn't like seeing that title, the headlines, but it was as though I was looking at the headlines. In other words, I was realizing the headlines, and then it was just, oh, gee, this is the day. So in other words, it was a in-time realization that this is the day, and it will happen in an hour or so, a couple of hours. Well, I promised somebody once that I would never allow any of the psychic stuff to interrupt my normal daily routine, which meant, I'm going to be in control enough and so on that I'm not going to leave work. I'm not going to jeopardize the normalcy of the household. And I really have to compliment myself that I've done a very good job controlling that. And this also was the first time that it did interrupt my normal daily routine. And when the time frame came about, I just couldn't tolerate it because I just knew too much about it. And I couldn't make a phone call, and I couldn't do much of anything about it. But I had also already shared publicly with Dr. Kenneth Rain, Dr. Bruce Grayson, and better than a dozen people at the University of Connecticut on a couple of occasions. And then obviously, using it, the details of it as an analogy several or many times at the talks at Marianne's hairdressing salon and a few other local places that I get a chance to talk. So it bothered me enough that I had to leave work. And I just made all the arrangements so that the job wasn't in jeopardy. And I came home, in just prior to, and there was a few seconds before the timing of the event, and then during the event, the only time that I ever called Dr. Bruce Grayson on the phone with a problem, I mean a serious problem. I call him for informational exchange, things like that. But I was just plain upset. And I didn't want to bother anybody, certainly nobody who would not understand. So I knew that he would understand being a psychiatrist and a good friend. So I called him, and I was already crying, and I was so upset that I was crying. And I said, I had to sort of blurt out. I said, well, this is Tom. And I said, I just wanted to call you. And then he said, and he's a really nice guy, he said, well, Tom, I think I understand. I think I understand why you're calling. And he said, has it happened yet? And then, he knew and I knew. So I said, well, I don't know what time it is right now, but it's happening right now. So then just in the capacity of that friend, I just sat there on the phone, and I was saying things like, I was swearing, and I was, in a way swearing, but I was actually saying the true meaning of the word, God damn it. And I mean, I wasn't just saying a word that's casual. I was actually wishing for God to damn the intensity of it, the emotional attachment of it, the reality of it. And so I just, sort of complained a little bit to him on the phone and just said, why do I have to know this? So I was kind of feeling sorry for myself. All right, so that's told the story in reverse. On the onset of this precognition, I believe it was October 12th. For some reason that date is ringing a bell, because there were two things that happened on October 12th of different years that were precognitive, having to do with airplanes. So in October of the year before, I would say October of '84, at a roundtable discussion at the University of Connecticut at the Near Death Hotel, Ken Ring's residence, we're staying up all night, and it was also 3:15 in the morning, which is apparently my favorite time. A lot of things seem to finalize or culminate right at 3:15 in the morning. And I was talking about the life and times of Jesus Christ. And I was just rattling off on a roll, just talking about him as though he was my next-door neighbor, which I did a couple of times. And I was on that roll, concentrating on that. Well, there were four women, Ken Ring's fiancée and three other women, just off to the right of me at the end of this very large table, talking about a combination of a book and a film. And that's not true. I've got this totally out of time. All right, because I'm thinking that the film and the book was the L-1011, right? Which it was, but it wasn't the same plane. They were talking about, and I think the movie is called The Ghost of Flight 401, and the book probably by the same name. I haven't seen the book, but I know it was in a book form. Well, they were just chatting about it. And I think they were really chatting about the aspect of ghostly apparitions. In other words, ghost stories, bona fide apparitions, that a friendly ghost can actually appear to you and give you information that will assist and help your situation or us situation. And they were talking about the aspects that some earthbound entities, therefore ghosts, are earthbound by their own desire or by their own demand that they cannot release their attachment toward either material things or mankind, humanity, things like that. So that's what their discussion was. I wasn't listening to them, but then in a loud enough voice for me to hear, they said something like the last sentence in the book or the last part of the movie, and they were glad to have the pilot was the ghost. The ghostly apparition said, there will, was supposed to have said, and you can look it up in the book if you find it, there will never be another crash of an L-1011. Well, that had that kind of a reaction to me, because, this is in a way very childish, because I'm attached to this airplane.
Right.
I like L-1011s. And, well, anyway, so the woman said the sentence, there will never be another crash of an L-1011. And, of course, I just turned my head and I said, but that's not true. So I shocked everybody. I interrupted their flow of their conversation. Now, Dr. Kenneth Ring realizes right away, wait a minute, Tom is saying something. So then I became very upset and distraught, because as they said that lie, or that mistake, see, they weren't lying, but they said a non-truth. That bothers me. So I had to correct them. That was a demand of mine. Didn't know anything about it before. So in other words, by that way, either the power of suggestion or whatever, or in order for me to know that truth, then like that, I knew all these details of the next crash of an L-1011. And that's how it happened. I said to them a few details about it. And then I realized, consciously, I realized what I was doing. In other words, I'm talking about something that hasn't happened yet. That bothered me, because remember, I'm offended by all this psychic stuff. So I interrupted myself, went out on the balcony and collected myself emotionally and so on, and came back. And Ken Ring did his psychology voice on me, and he said, in a deep voice, well, Tom, apparently, and I looked at him, I said, Ken, knock off the psychology stuff, this is just me. And he said, says, obviously, something has upset you. He says, it's something that you wish to discuss. And then there was that tugging between, I have some information and I want to share it. I mean, I want to tell you everything about it, but I can't. Maybe I shouldn't. It's the only maybe, the question mark. Maybe I shouldn't. And this is just beyond me. This is too emotional for me because I'm talking about, I even purposely block out the number of people involved because at one time I started naming the people. And of course, to do that, I have to know each one of those people personally. I mean, like intimately, like they were a brother or sister. So that was hard, naturally, you could imagine.
In a way, yes. But I think I said this to you the other day. If, having been in the light, you know that this hundreds of people are going to be instantaneously into the light, why would that not bring out a feeling more of celebration than of the pain?
There's many, again, within me, there's many reasons why. Number one, and probably the least amount, is an actual feeling of jealousy. Now, bear with me if I say this. I'll get that out of the way, that there's an actual feeling of jealousy that I have to be here, and I'm happy. I mean, I'm the happiest person you'll ever meet. I'm happy, glad to be here. This is nice. This is all okay. And I appreciate the opportunity, right? But I have an ongoing preference to die. I mean, to go back into that light and get on with things, get on with the next chapter of the real life. I mean, I think that this is reality, but there's a greater reality that we're anticipating. So there's a little degree of jealousy that why do I have to be here and observe people dying and moving on, going through their transitional state, which we call death, with a frown on our face, and get on with things, and I'm stuck here. So there's a little degree of jealousy. More importantly, it's just the compassion in me for anybody and everybody, that there is the onset of that transitional state, which is often gross and painful and miserable and chaotic. In other words,
all the other lives it touches in the meantime.
Sure. For each person that died on that plane, there are at least 5 people that had to go through bereavement, had to go through the trauma of being told, the shock of the loss, all that stuff, which is understandable. And I knew some of those people. In other words, as part of the precognition, I knew, in other words, I would recognize the face of some of the relatives of those people. So it had to do with the compassion that, gee, why? The question, why does this have to take place? Also, there was originally a realization that this is going to be history and that there is nothing that I can do about it. Now, the long version of the story, which we can't tell today, is that part of my learning experiences was, at one time I decided that I don't care what I've been given or told or the rules and regulations of that which I know spiritually. I'm going to go against that because I can't stand this any longer and I want to do something about it. And that didn't work. And I had to go through that and learn that too. And that was just personally for me, that was another chapter of this, the long version of the story. Another aspect of why it is so difficult, even now, I mean, this is years later, and it's so, not really traumatic, but emotional for me, was to just intimately, and I mean really intimately, know these individuals and lose them. See, that's selfish, because it's the aspect of bereavement that is selfish. In other words, how could he leave me? Why did he do this to me? My husband died on me. That, God bless the people that are experiencing that, but the reality is that at that point, and regarding that aspect, you or they and I was being selfish, that I've lost another intimate friend. So there was that self-loss that I was bereaving, and even still bereaved for now, to a little degree, minor degree. Most intensively, it was to, bear with me if I say experience to a degree, I hope I can say this without concentrating on it too much, experience well, I'll use the word the victims of the plane crash that are still alive. That is very difficult for me, and bear with me if I'm looking away and everything, because I can say it and not attach myself to the extreme memory of that or the reality of that. For instance, here we are in, I was going to say 88, 89, so we're 4 years later, and there are people who are still hospitalized. The horrendous amount of burning. Let me put it this way. Say, for instance, a paramedic who is trained for that and yet goes to a plane crash, and the numbers. Now, they've dealt with identical injuries where the person is burned beyond recognition, not even sure it's a human being, but then have the person say, "Will you help me?" and then realize that it's a burned human being, and then have that person live on, right? The paramedic can deal with that, but to suddenly see 100, 160 people like that, the numbers are overwhelming. The intensity is overwhelming. The duration of time of suffering, pain and suffering, all that is overwhelming. So all those aspects are overwhelming to me. It goes way beyond my emotional threshold. And if you realize that, it's understandable. There's many other things. I'm a biased and prejudiced person like all of us are. It was, I fell in love with a particular little girl on that plane. And she didn't burn to death. She died from trauma from her spinal column and her neck and her back snapped. I don't know if that's ever been publicized. I don't know if they would have any way to find out. But to say, be with her on that plane. See, I can say it that way to have a perception. To be with her and watch her fly through the air and bounce off the ceiling and go to the forward part of the plane and then ricochet at an angle and hit the headrest of the fourth or fifth seat from the front of the plane on the right-hand side. See, to know that. I mean, bear with me if I say, I was on that plane. That's not the truth, but symbolically. So that makes it more emotional and intensive. And that's why it upsets me so much, and I have such an emotional attachment. It's just some of the reasons. There's many, many more details. Things that I said that night. In other words, Ken Ring questioned me further, and I said things like, because a lot of the details were confusing then, and over the next year, I brought out many, many more details. Either just subconsciously, I brought it into a conscious level, but that night, I said things that I didn't understand about it. As I was complaining, actually. First of all, why do I have to know this? That basic complaint. Why do I have to know it's 103 degrees? How come I can see a white building, but I can't see it clear? And I'm not actually questioning clairvoyance, because that means see clear. I kind of laughed when I thought of that afterwards. But it was that I questioned, why can't I see this white building, which I said white building, clearly? And never realizing or put two and two together the fact that it was in a thunderstorm also, and the dark clouds and the amount of rain, visually, a camera, or my eyes, the theoretical eyes, wasn't able to see that which was not even a white building, which was a white tank, a very large white tank. And again, I don't like the psychic games that a lot of people play, like, soon you will be near plant life. And the person lives in an apartment with no plants at all, and they came back the next week, say, nothing regarding plant life. Say, well, did you walk down the street, walk by a tree? Ah, there you go. And to say, for instance, for me to say the word, a white building, I don't like that, because, see, that turns out it was not a building at all. The dictionary definition of a building is not a tank. Yeah, I can justify it by saying, in hindsight of the plane crash, and that which I learned on the television news broadcast later on was, of course, I couldn't see the white tank. But since it was straight and white and large, it was a building. I mean, it isn't a stone. See, I can justify it, but if somebody heard me that first night, and then after the event takes place, here I am like playing that psychic game where I'm justifying what I said, fitting the scenario of the plane crash. Granted, it was lopsided because I had given serial numbers, people's first names, so many details that couldn't ever be faked or anything. I mean, 103 degrees is odd, things like that, but I was complaining about that which I didn't know about it. And then I even pounded the table and said, yeah, but you would think that the two most important things are when and where. And why do I have to know all these details and not know the basic when, exactly when and where? So I dealt with that for over a year, and that was... I really would wish, maybe in a couple of weeks or so, we could do the long version of that story and only talk about that, because I think if nothing else, it would even be therapeutic for me to say finalize it. It's not that I want it documented or I want it advertised, but I mean, I think that I would get something out of starting at the beginning and working my way all the way through it, because there's an awful lot of spirituality, an awful lot of psychology, an awful lot of psychic things that can be dealt with. Other people can use that as an analogy to explain to other people for teaching and learning, and then also for me to talk about something that isn't clear. It clarifies it for myself often. New and significant details about me can come out. Not that I need to have you know that or anybody else, but for me to learn that for myself.
In the last maybe 15 minutes of the tape, is there any area you'd like to cover or kind of sum up, either to do with the priesthood or the future or anything at all?
Yeah, there's a couple things just regarding the priesthood, because, sometimes I view or realize the existence of the priesthood, and I'm very simplistic about it. In other words, sometimes I think of it as a very wonderful network, but leave it as that. In other words, never mind the religious/spiritual aspects of it at all, just the fact that since there's a priesthood and there are hundreds involved, and they, of course, are all over the country, all over the world, I mean outside the country, all over the world, that represents to me, shall I dare say selfishly, as the way in which I have in the past dealt with the priesthood, that is a wonderful grapevine or networking system. And having those type of people, here, I say those type of people, as all you kind of people, it is convenient and comfortable for me to talk about things that I can't talk about to many people. Because can I go to the Catholic priest and tell him some of the things about the life and times of Jesus Christ? No, and I shouldn't. But I could say it to you. I could say it to almost anybody who would be watching this tape. All you weird people. You abnormal people, thank God. But anyway, regarding that, that's one of the beautiful aspects of it. That may even be, bear with me if I'm being judgmental now, that may even become or come to pass to be the most important aspect of it. The fact that we are networking and reaching out and touching people as a form of a family or a priesthood. I mean, the dictionary definition extended says this also, that it be that, and to have similar desires, aspects, and love gestures, prayer, the reality of Christianity, things of this nature are powerful. And what good is any of it? Well, it's nice to have camaraderie. But wait a minute, let me give you a quick example. I mean, we have been successful. I mean, not only successful, well, let's say, wait a minute, what have I done? Well, let me put it this way. If I had a precognition of a tragic nature, and of course there was the longest duration one of over 10 years, of the nuclear detonation of a malicious nature, and see, since it's gone, I don't even get emotional about it, where before, I just try so hard to say that sentence, and I couldn't, and sometimes I would even ask you to say it so we could get on with what I want to say about it. A nuclear detonation of a malicious nature was to have had taken place in Lebanon, in Sur, Lebanon, S-O-U-R with a funny mark over it, in the area of Tyre, Lebanon, Tyre, and the Quasimar region of Lebanon, right? And that was known to me. It was known to a few other people more than 11 years ago now. In other words, it was one of the things that I came back from my near-death experience with, and it was on a conscious level by that third or fourth day after my accident. And I worked with that ongoing. I worked with that with the military by way of the Pentagon, directly and indirectly, psychically by other psychics, by other spiritual people who spiritually, precognitively knew something about it, but not everything. The IONS organization, the International Association for Near-Death Studies, was used as a clearinghouse, so to speak, or a focus point for near-death experiencers, other near-death experiencers, to say anything they wanted to say. And of course, it came to pass that a group of near-death experiencers had a similar, or the same, they had the same precognition, but some of them only knew what it looked like. They only knew the time frame. And again, the time frame...
What the time frame on that was?
I've almost blocked it out of my mind, but let me remember. It would have been, the deadline, as best I can recall, would have been August 15th of course, 88. See, I've got that blocked out of my mind, but then I have to smile because one of the things that I was written up in the book Heading Toward Omega, that's not a plug, in Heading Toward Omega was, I was questioned by Ken Ring saying, well, Tom, we know you don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but let me say, for instance, will it be 1991? And then, see, for him to say the wrong thing, I would, like, get angry at him, or not angry, but it was, he made a mistake. He's telling a non-truth. So in order to correct him, it would be typical of me to say the correct thing, but it was curious the way it came out, because I corrected him and said, oh, no, Ken, it has to be an Olympic year. Well, that became very significant because, of course, I'm related in a way to Olympic years. That's meaningful to me, the 68 Olympic trials. And I know every 4 years when the Olympic trials will happen again. And as I often, for better than 10 years, I lived for the Olympic trials every 4 years. The 3 years in between was practice and training. The major races and so on were every 4 years for bicycle racing. So it would be apropos and typical of me to say that. But Mark Evans, who had nothing to do with sports, didn't even know about, well, he knew that there was a thing called the Olympic Games, and he knew that when the Games are held, it's an Olympic year, was not aware of the next Olympic year. Now, there's one question further, but when he was questioned the same way I was, in fact, at the same time, they had him on the telephone long distance, and I was in Connecticut, and it was kind of a trick in a way, because they had a time frame. They said, okay, ask the question now. And Ken Ring asked that question of me, while secretaries were asking the same question of Mark Evans, long distance. And he said, oh, no, it has to be an Olympic year. Now, there's several possibilities that I don't want to go into now, that he could have been clairvoyantly or telepathically in tune with me, or any of that combination. But that went in the records. Anyway, the records eventually showed a lot of detail. I can't go into too much detail about the event that was to have taken place, or I don't wish to at this time, but it included military activity. And as that developed, in fact, helped me with the time frame, because in the summer of, in July of 1988, July, things come out in July. In July of 1988, I went on the Phil Donahue show. Well, I was concerned because I knew that it was that year. I knew that it was very hot out because, of course, in Lebanon, I don't like the heat anyway. That it was very hot out. I knew what it looked like. I knew that it had to be in an area like, also, by that time, by July of 1988,
I know several of us, you were asking to fervently pray.
Yeah. I had already gone to the priesthood, and it was the grapevine.
Right.
And and gave the exact location. I had written down a location in reference point within the foot, the number of feet. Also, an event took place just prior to that was internationally significant, which I made a map of and wrote down before the event, which was shown to the military, was handed over to the military. But anyway, the point I'm trying to bring out is I started questioning the spiritual flow of things, which I should not have done. But I wasn't getting the kind of information I would have been comfortable with. And I was prepared to do anything to prevent this event from taking place. I would have given my life. I would have physically gone there. In fact,
You were going to?
Yeah, I made, on 2 occasions, seriously, I made plans to go there. Not knowing, well, what am I going to do there? Well, if need be, for instance, if nothing else was ever done, I would have gone there and, ran into that garage-type warehouse and tried to, do something. Talk or crash the machine apart or do something or create a stir of some kind, a diversion. Even if it be postponed, would have been better than allowing that to take place.
Right. And what actually did happen?
Right. Well, now let's see, I'm in a time frame because I want to also just quickly mention that how we changed the attitude of the one Muslim bomber. In the priesthood, we fervently prayed, and in that capacity of collective spiritual energy, and then focusing, it did not necessarily have to have me focusing on the exact location, like by eyesight, or any of that. That wasn't a necessity. But with that enhancement, the collective energy that we, the priesthood, were able to focus on, for example, we were able to love bomb this driver who was loaded with, was a suicide thing. Now, religiously, the Muslims do things like this, and they think that they will get great merit, and that they will die in glory, and so on, that they will go to nirvana or heaven, and be with Allah, in the good graces of Allah to do this, even if it be death and destruction and a suicide. So, brainwashing, cultural conditioning, religious fervor, you choose your own category. So this was to be done, and you have to understand the Muslim tradition, that this was not just, well, I think I'll do this. No, this was a demand. This was in glory. This was, you have to do everything possible to try to accomplish this. So he was in the process of driving to an American checkpoint to blow it up. And by his own description in his native language, which was translated to, I'm sure that it's documented somewhere because somebody told me that it was on the news, and I think I have an article, a newspaper article, and it said that he was overcome by a good feeling, and that he decided that he should not go through with this. And he parked the truck, walked over, identified himself, said what he was going to do, that he didn't want to do it, that the truck over there is very dangerous, and that he wants to be protected now from his own people, because having not accomplished this mission, he would be killed or murdered by his own Muslim people. And that he was starting feeling a type of love that he couldn't describe, and so on. And he went on babbling about it for hours. Well, very bluntly and honestly, we, not I mean we collectively, the people, the lovers of the world, the spiritual beings, the people who fervently pray for peace, pray to the Christ light, let thy will be done. The people who have more information and pray for the people who are being misguided in the Middle East. The people who are so fanatically building nuclear bombs to be detonated. Okay, can we love the individual enough? You can't telekinetically blow up the detonating device. You can't telekinetically blow up the truck before it gets to its target, killing only one man as opposed to 35 men. You can't do that. There's not quite enough power in our ability to telekinetically love in that way or focus. But there is the ability to love unconditionally and change the attitude of the individual involved. And in this case, the driver of that truck, in another case, to give enough bona fide information and so on to the military so that they in fact can capture and collect the nuclear device, which was done, and it was prevented. And I thought by then my job would be over and I would have a new ability to just be normal in my own self. And of course that was more than a year ago now, and I'm still here and I'm smiling most of the time.
We still have our work to do.
Yes, we do. And I'm just sorry that I can't be with the people that are viewing this now, so we could have questions and answers directly and get more information back and forth.
Well, thank you, Tom. This is going to be very helpful.
A couple of weeks, I'll be better. And
Okay.
I'm really looking forward, maybe in the spring, this next springtime, especially because again today our focus was for the people in the Florida area.